Zulfi Bhutto of Pakistan, His Life and Times by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 15, New Elections and Their Tragic Aftermath. Early 1977. On 12th May, Bhutto informed the National Assembly that Asghar Khan's letter to the armed forces was an act of high treason. The following day, he announced his plan to hold a referendum on his continuance in his present office. He insisted that holding new National Assembly elections would prove disastrous for Pakistan. The National Assembly proclaimed Friday, no longer Sunday, Pakistan's weekly holiday and banned all forms of gambling. 2 persons were killed in Multan and 10 injured when police opened fire on a procession led by the opposition. The Prime Minister's courageous decision of holding referendum has taken the opposition alliance by a complete surprise, reported Rao Rashid Khan. Even the opposition leaders feel that the Prime Minister's own personality is, by and large, undisputed and that the people are most likely to give their vote of confidence. As expected, the Pakistan National Alliance rejected the idea and threatened to boycott any referendum. Rao Rashid felt, however, that if the popular turnout for a referendum was anywhere close to what the vote had been for the National Assembly, the opposition's bluff would be called out and it would be totally discredited. All information media therefore had to carry out a scientific and credible campaign to convince the public of their duty to turn out in large numbers and vote for the Prime Minister. Rao Rashid Khan had done such a good job as a special secretary that he was promoted to Director of Intelligence Bureau, where he had access to more information to feed to his Prime Minister, including a warning in early June that the Pir of Pagaro had been consulting an astrologer who told him that the government would fall on the 7th of June. Another local astrologer told him, however, that nothing would happen on 7th but that the 22nd or 23rd of June are unlucky for the Prime Minister. Zulfi received many letters from mystics, one from a Maulana who now urgently offered to recite particular verses of Quran on your face, as he had done with successful results in early period of your rule. A self-proclaimed spiritualist, elder statesman, had a month earlier guaranteed within one day to save and redeem Zulfi, otherwise warning, you are doomed, repeat, doomed, and history shall never pardon you. Zulfi read and kept such letters but had no time during this crisis to see as many mystics as he used to see in years past. He barely had time to annotate all the files and secret reports that kept flooding in, filling his bedroom floor at night and half his bed as well. One secret letter from Karachi transmitted a message telephoned from a London astrologer who wanted Bhutto to know that everything would be all right. He said that you should be firm with the people who are causing trouble, and after 17th July, you would emerge much stronger and would be in a position to eliminate the elements who had been responsible for disturbances in the country. Another admirer addressed him Great Colossus and also urged him to be firm, brave, and bold. You cannot placate these wrathful gods set atop the opposition. Every time you concede, they take it as a symptom of failing strength. Soviet Ambassador S.A. Asimov encouraged Bhutto not to resign his office, for in the Soviet view, the Prime Minister's resignation was not in the interest of Pakistan, nor was it in the interest of peace, stability, and security in South Asia. Zulfi replied that the ambassador was very intelligent, and Asimov informed him that the mullahs have no genuine support and people were being paid and bribed to agitate. He also told Bhutto that Soviet leaders believed that destiny was blessing the Prime Minister and that the time had come for him to take the historic decision to quit Cento. Zulfi stated that he would do so only if Pakistan received definite promises from the Soviet Union of continued and uninterrupted supply of military hardware. The needs and requirements of the armed forces had to be fulfilled. Not that he was ready to quit CENTO immediately, for the matter needed careful and cool consideration. Asimov understood and was patient, but did his best to encourage the Prime Minister by feeding his already hot resentment against US interference. He informed Bhutto that his friend Bayrod, before the elections, had sent the State Department his own assessment that Pakistan National Alliance would win 60% and Pakistan People's Party only 40% of the vote. According to the ambassador, the United States was afraid of Pakistan's independent foreign policy and its support for the Arabs in their just struggle against Israel. Asimov characterized the US approach towards developing country as that of a cowboy quick to use force. Zulfi announced the next day, 10th May, that he had decided not to send his foreign minister to the forthcoming meeting of CENTO in Tehran, nor would he attend it himself, leaving that job to Pakistan's envoy to Iran. Secretary of State Vance very much regretted that decision, commenting a few days later that he had hoped Pakistan might seize the opportunity for face-to-face discussions in Tehran. But Bhutto by now considered the United States his foremost international opponent. His tolerance for criticism had never been high, of course, but he also believed that US elephants were after him, as he told General Faiz Ali Chishti. On 11th May, Zulfi was flown to Sehala for a private meeting with ailing Mufti Mahmud. Was he encouraged by sudden Soviet promises of support, or by continued Libyan, Chinese, Saudi, and UAE support, or by what he thought to be a turning of the popular tide of protest against him? He brought no new concessions to Sehala, and next day the Mufti wrote to report unanimous agreement among all his colleagues that further dialogue would be fruitless, explaining, "I agreed to meet you in the hope that an honorable and speedy end may be found of the present impasse. I did this in good faith and disregarded any false sense of vanity or pride, in the hope that better sense would prevail and the country would be saved further bloodshed and misery. Unfortunately, you have tried to create the impression of a political dialogue in the hope that, in the meantime, the people's will to resist would be weakened." The Pakistan National Alliance was still insisting that Bhutto resign first and then call fresh elections. Zulfi feared that if he resigned, he would not live long enough to return to his position either as premier or president. And he may, indeed, have been right in that pessimistic judgment, not of his own popularity, but of his opponents' collective resolve to keep him out of power. Bhutto used his former tough home minister, Sardar Abdul Qayyum Khan, who had recently abandoned him to join the opposition, as his conduit for launching a new secret initiative with the Pakistan National Alliance leaders. Qayyum was kept in a Pindi rest house and was called in by Zulfi a week after his futile meeting with Mufti Mahmud. Zulfi urged him to bring all the others round the table for a package deal dialogue that was to be brief and could include new elections to the National Assembly but no resignation by the Prime Minister. On 19th May, Qayyum flew off and sold his colleagues on the deal by shrewdly insisting that they negotiate with Bhutto as de facto Prime Minister, nothing more, and then they would win fresh elections and throw him out. By the last week in May, both sides were tired of a deadlock that had developed and heartsick at the carnage it had wrought. More than 300 innocents dead, more than 30,000 opposition supporters behind bars, and most major cities controlled by armed troops. So the opposition agreed, and on 26th May, the Saudi ambassador returned to the Prime Minister's house to report the good news. All nine Pakistan National Alliance leaders had agreed that Mufti Mahmood, Nasrullah Khan, and Ghafoor Ahmad would serve as their dialogue team, the last to be brought to Sehala from his cell in Dadu. The one leader Zulfi preferred not to have to face was Asghar Khan, and Qayyum had made it clear to the others that it might be best to keep the former air marshal of the team. The Peer of Pagaro, of course, remained free, and in their warm reunion on 30th April at the Intercontinental Hotel, he had told Zulfi that the two of them were the only true leaders of Pakistan, the rest of the country's politicos being only paper leaders. The Peer had no better opinion of Asghar Khan than Zulfi did, and Bhutto did his best to play on such lack of solidarity with the Pakistan National Alliance leadership every time he met with any of them. They were all masters of devious tactics and were not trustworthy, Zulfi told the Saudi ambassador. Now that Qayyum had brought his opponents around, Zulfi stiffened his position, making several new demands, smelling victory and not wanting to surrender more of his power than was absolutely necessary. First of all, he demanded written, not just verbal acceptance by the Pakistan National Alliance to enter into talks with the government, of which he must be recognized as the constitutional prime minister, not simply a de facto one. Bhutto suddenly insisted, moreover, that he needed the permission of his party to enter into talks and also wanted to consult ranking members of the armed forces. The ambassador promised to go to Sahala at 10 a.m. on the next day. He reported back on 27th May, bringing a draft of Mufti Mahmood's letter to Bhutto. Zulfi was not, however, satisfied with the draft and insisted that unless the Pakistan National Alliance was more reasonable, there would be no agreement. He then wasted an hour of his own and his Saudi mediator's time in free associating about the Peer of Pagaro and Mustafa Khar, whom he had brought up like his own son and had treated like one. But since Mustafa Khar had lied, Zulfi explained, he had to throw him out. And after he had made Khar into the Sher-e-Punjab, Mustafa had intrigued against him and even became vice president of the Peer of Pagaro's Muslim League. Now he had come back and fallen on his feet and begged to be forgiven for his past mistakes. Zulfi, of course, forgave him, but rhetorically inquired of the tired Saudi ambassador, who was much too diplomatic to interrupt the disjointed monologue of this prime minister. Why had the Sher-e-Punjab suddenly decided to leave the opposition? The answer, quite clear to Zulfi's racing mind, was that Mustafa Khar was an extremely selfish man and had felt that the Pakistan National Alliance, despite all the recent happenings, had limited support. Yes, that was it. And that was why they had all agreed to come to the table to talk. Then why give them anything to talk about? When Zulfi finally stopped, the ambassador softly suggested that the dialogue should be approached with an open mind and should be handled with great care. But it was too late for Bhutto to follow such wise advice. With the Lion of Punjab at his feet, Zulfi hoped soon to rout his opponents, whether or not he sat round the table with any of them or all of them. He had never liked that Gang of Nine. And who were they, after all, to negotiate with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto? Those few who were born to tribal power had no Oxford or California degrees, and those with degrees had no family traditions or money. He alone combined the two, hence, he alone was fit to rule Pakistan. Didn't they know that? Of course they knew. That was why they were now so keen, so eager, so ready to sit around the table with him. He understood their game far better than any of those paper leaders ever did or ever would. The Saudi ambassador requested an interview with Bhutto on 30th May, and Zulfi invited ministers Hafiz Pirzada and Kausar Niazi, his negotiating teammates, to join them. The next day, Bhutto met in Pindi with the Armed Forces Chief of Staff and the Corps Commander of the Army. Then Zulfi told the ambassador he was now ready for talks with the Pakistan National Alliance team after midday prayers on Friday, 3rd June. But that date, Bhutto had realized all the incarcerated leaders except for Asghar Khan, who was let out of his prison at Sahiwal only after he learned that he had been released by listening to the broadcast over BBC World News inside his cell at 10 p.m. on the 4th of June. The Pakistan National Alliance suspended its agitation as the talks started on 3rd June, and a full bench of Lahore High Court declared that the government's imposition of martial law in 3 cities was unconstitutional. That decision was appealed to the Supreme Court. Yahya Bakhtiar and Hafiz Pirzada both advised Bhutto to lift the martial law decree, and after a second round of talks on 7th June, an executive order to do so was issued with immediate effect. Minister Pirzada and Ghafoor Ahmad were now assigned to task of working out details of the formula for an agreement between the government and the Pakistan National Alliance. They met again on 9th June, but now some basic differences about when to hold fresh elections surfaced. Zulfi had no intention of holding national elections again in 1977, and the Pakistan National Alliance wanted free and fair elections last month or the month before. After 3 rounds of talks, the differences were almost as irreconcilable as ever. By the end of the 5th round on June 10th, the parties were deadlocked. The whole country is expecting a settlement. Intelligence Director Rao Rashid Khan warned his Prime Minister that afternoon. Unfortunately, the credibility of the government is so low that the blame of the deadlock would be placed squarely at the door of the government. The Pakistan National Alliance supporters will at once take to the streets. In the Punjab and in the big cities of Sindh, the agitation in the short term would be extremely violent. The army will have to be very quickly called in aid of civil power. This would raise complications. After the decision of the Lahore High Court, the army would be extremely reluctant to side with the government and expose themselves again to public ridicule and humiliation. Even if the senior generals behave responsibly, some kind of revolt in the rank and file, especially if they have to resort to large number of killings, can be expected. Rao Rashid Khan urged the desirability of some sort of political settlement. He suggested either of 2 options. The first, to call fresh elections in August without stepping down or bringing the Pakistan National Alliance into government. The second, to postpone elections till November, but it would be impossible to keep the Pakistan National Alliance out of government that long. Hence, he deemed the first alternative preferable. The clever director of intelligence believed that the Pakistan People's Party would win in August, provided its tickets to candidates were awarded more equitably and wisely, and there was politically minded administration in the provinces, especially in Punjab. Zulfi was inclined to agree with this shrewd advice, especially now that he had the Lion of Punjab back at his feet, ready to spring into action in Lahore. Internationally, Bhutto was faced with equally troublesome options, for President Carter had just turned down the Pentagon's recommendation to sell 110 A-7 fighter bombers to Pakistan. Though the French continued to promise that they would adhere to their nuclear reprocessing plant agreement, they had as yet shipped no part of it to Pakistan, and Zulfi now feared they would capitulate to Washington's pressure. The evening of 10th June, he addressed his party in the National Assembly again and warned that Pakistan might quit CENTO because CENTO was discriminating against Pakistan and the United States was trying to intimidate him. Zulfi had met with Secretary General Umit Yulkan of CENTO in early April and had been briefed by him on his recent trips to London and Washington. The Secretary General felt it would be understandable if Pakistan were to leave CENTO, but had the impression after the meetings in Washington with the new Secretary of Defense, Harold Brown, and with people at the State Department that United States valued Pakistan as an ally and hoped to find a satisfactory solution to the reprocessing plant question. But that was 2 months ago. Then on 31st May, Foreign Minister Aziz Ahmed had met with Secretary of State Vance and Carter's newly appointed ambassador to Pakistan, Arthur W. Hummel, and briefed them both in great detail about Prime Minister's concern and evidence of American intervention in the recent elections. He also told Vance about the Soviet ambassador's recent meetings with Bhutto in an effort to get Pakistan to leave CENTO and join the Soviet Asian Collective Security System, thus giving the Soviet Union access to the Indian Ocean. That was, of course, also why the Soviets were involved in subversion in Balochistan. Hence, if Pakistan became weak, Aziz Ahmed explained to Vance and Hummel, there would be a Soviet avalanche in this region. Zulfi had hoped that so frank a report on Soviet attempts to win his hand might revive Washington's waning passion for Pakistan, and Vance had indeed assured the foreign minister of his deep conviction that cordial relations between the United States and Pakistan were important to both countries and to the stability of the entire South Asian region. The liberal new ambassador also informed Aziz Ahmed that he would follow the path of friendship and cooperation and do his best to promote better cooperation between the United States and Pakistan during his tenure in Islamabad. That was less than 2 weeks ago, and now the president had turned down the A-17's deal. And every other day, either the New York Times or the International Herald Tribune carried a report of French decision to slow down or scrape the reprocessing plant. And every day, the Voice of America repeated in its broadcasts to Pakistan that the Prime Minister must resign and new elections must be called. Zulfi appealed to his Chinese friends for help, but with Mao and Chao both dead, he knew there was little likelihood of much aid from Beijing. On 11th June, the Pakistan National Alliance demanded fair elections within 30 days. All negotiators returned to the table 4 more times in the next 4 days, and after the 9th round of talks ended on 15th June, both sides announced that they had reached agreement on the basic issues. Subcommittees met the next day to hammer out details of the final agreement, and Bhutto that evening told his National Assembly audience that fresh national elections would soon be held in the larger interests of Pakistan. That same day, he swore Mustafa Khar back into the government as his special assistant and met once again with the Soviet ambassador Asimov. Zulfi told Asimov about Aziz Ahmed's Paris meeting with Vance, who had said he would like to open a new chapter in Pakistan-US relations. But now it seemed as if the new page was no different from the old page. If the Pakistan National Alliance leaders were serious about quitting CENTO, as their election manifesto advocated, Bhutto was now ready to take a joint national decision with them on that point and had therefore instructed Hafiz Pirzada to take up the question of Cento in his meetings with Ghaffur Ahmad. Now, he asked Ambassador Asimov whether the Soviet Union would react as a greater power or as a human power. The Soviet ambassador warned Bhutto that the United States would be starting a new campaign against him between August and November 1977, and he should remain very vigilant. The Soviet Union was watching the situation very closely and deeply regretted the diabolical game that the United States was playing against the Prime Minister's government. Soviet leaders, both in Moscow and Islamabad, Ambassador Asimov declared, hoped and prayed that the Prime Minister would find a way out of the present difficult situation and reach a solution in the supreme national interest of Pakistan. He had no doubt that the Prime Minister would use his ingenuity, skill, experience, and political acumen to overcome the present difficulties. The ambassador then told Bhutto that Soviet representatives in Washington had been informed by the US State Department that Mr. Bhutto was not willing to leave Cento, but was sending signals to Moscow only to pressurize the United States, and that there was no substance in the Prime Minister's statements. Asimov also urged Zulfi to take the more fruitful initiative of quitting Cento on his own and not wait for the Pakistan National Alliance's cooperation because that would strengthen the Prime Minister's position. Such a step would open up more opportunities for Soviet-Pakistani cooperation. Asimov added. Zulfi was angered to learn that the State Department had informed Moscow of the top secret information he'd asked Aziz Ahmad to convey to Vance, after he had received it in equally secret confidence from Asimov. And he was frustrated with Asimov's vague rejoinder to his substantive proposal. The ambassador had not said anything new, and it did not constitute a concrete reply. Zulfi now insisted that the United States was misleading Soviet representatives by informing them that his statements about planning to leave Cento were made only for tactical reasons. Washington knew that he was the only Pakistani leader with the courage to do it, which was why it was so worried about him. If the Soviet Union was already to extend solid and concrete assurances for military and economic assistance to Pakistan, then he would be able to take the decision to quit Cento. That would be the biggest possible slap to the United States, Zulfi explained, and could also be regarded as a success for Soviet foreign policy. The ambassador was delighted and promised to inform Moscow immediately, but also wanted to be able to inform his superiors of the date on which new elections would be held. Zulfi told Asimov that 7th October 1977 was the date that had finally been agreed upon in the last round of negotiations. He confessed that the Pakistan People's Party had been overconfident on the eve of the last elections and had not expected such large-scale foreign interference, but promised by October to be fully prepared to meet any eventuality. And by October, he expected many contradictions to surface within the Pakistan National Alliance. He would not even rule out disunity. He sounded like the old Zulfi, politically astute, self-confident, optimistic, certain that even at present the masses were loyal to him and his Pakistan People's Party. He had categorically rejected the Pakistan National Alliance's demand to share power in an interim government. Moreover, and still believed that he would remain at the helm of Pakistan as well as his party until at least the end of the first week in October. Turning to India, Zulfi said to Asimov that he had known Prime Minister Desai since childhood, when the new head of India's Janata coalition had come to see his father in Bombay. He pointedly called Asimov's attention to a recent statement by Morarji Desai about how in 1971 the United States had driven India into the arms of Soviet Union. The clever ambassador praised the Prime Minister's judgment and superior knowledge of India, to which Zulfi replied that 1000 years of Hindu-Muslim struggle furnished ample evidence of the Hindu character. The Muslims knew Indians well. If the Soviet Union wanted to control India, then the Soviet Union should bless and befriend Pakistan. The ambassador was quick to insist that his government had no desire to control India. The Soviet Union only wanted friendship with both India and Pakistan. Zulfi laughed and said he had used the wrong word. He then repeated how much he should like the assurance of a steady supply of military assistance to help Pakistan shed Sento to teach the US a lesson. Ambassador Asimov cautioned Bhutto that the United States and its allies had a new plan against Pakistan for August and November and might resort to other actions and other means. He urged the Prime Minister to be very careful about his personal security. Even an attempt of assassination could not be ruled out. But Zulfi felt confident that his elite federal security force now kept him well covered from every single angle. 2 days later, Bhutto flew to Riyadh to meet with King Khalid and express his gratitude for the positive and meaningful role Saudi Arabia had played in resolving the differences between his government and the opposition. The king said he considered it his duty to bring about reconciliation among brothers. He hoped that the crisis in Pakistan would be resolved as a result of the agreement reached this week. Zulfi said that he had not come to Saudi Arabia to criticize the Pakistan National Alliance leaders or to portion blame or fault to anyone, but went on to say that both the Soviet Union and the United States had interfered in the internal affairs of Pakistan. He blamed the United States much more, however, because it had great influence in Pakistan, unlike the Soviet Union. He said that Kissinger had told the Pakistani ambassador in Washington after his August 1976 visit to Pakistan that if the Democrats won the election in the United States, they would make a horrible example of Pakistan if Pakistan acquired the nuclear reprocessing plant. Dr. Kissinger had explained to the ambassador that President Carter was determined not to allow any further proliferation of nuclear weapons. Bhutto added that his government had ample evidence of US intervention in Pakistan's internal affairs. It had not only financed the Pakistan National Alliance's election campaign but also advised the opposition on the strategy and tactics of agitational politics. Zulfi concluded his audience by telling King Khalid that the main purpose of his brief visit to Riyadh was to inquire after the king's health. The king thanked him and wished him great success in all his endeavors. From Saudi Arabia, Zulfi flew to Libya, Iran, Abu Dhabi, and Kuwait. His warmest meeting was with Brother Gaddafi, who promised him full support. The Shah was very cool, however, and by now Zulfi believed that he was working hand in glove with the United States and several Pakistan National Alliance leaders to destabilize his government. The Sheikh of Abu Dhabi helped restore his confidence and optimism, at least enough to encourage Zulfi to propose another Islamic Summit conference in Pakistan and a treaty of non-aggression among all Muslim countries by which he hoped to derail the worrisome mobilization of Iranian troops along the Balochistan border. Success of a second Lahore conference, an international Third World Forum by the end of this year or early next year, perhaps to celebrate his 50th birthday, would finally put to rest internal mullah opposition against him by firmly establishing his position as the premier host and champion of the Islamic world. Then, petty mullahs like Mufti Mahmud and Islamic professors like Ghafoor Ahmad would treat him with proper deference and the respect he deserved. In Kuwait, Zulfi met with Yasser Arafat as well as the Amir, and before returning home, he stopped in Kabul for another brief summit with President Dawood. While Bhutto was abroad, the Pakistan People's Party, Pakistan National Alliance subcommittee that was to have ironed out all the details of the agreement deadlocked over fundamental differences that had never been resolved. Pakistan National Alliance leaders now trusted him no more than they had on March 8th, fearing that he had simply used the time he had won by his willingness to negotiate with them to consolidate his power, both internally and internationally. He not only had brought Mustafa Khar on board to recapture Punjab in October, but had launched Mumtaz Bhutto on a most successful tour of Sindh, preparing the political ground in smaller towns and villages for what would surely prove to be another Bhutto victory among his people. From press reports of him in Libya, Abu Dhabi, and Kuwait, and his optimistic statements to the National Assembly on 23rd June after his return about the good exchange with Sardar Dawood, it was increasingly clear that he would try to conclude a settlement with Afghanistan on the eve of the elections, perhaps even releasing Wali Khan and certainly Bazinjo, which would give him a fair shake at possibly winning both frontier provinces. It was Zulfi dancing the political waltz again, which he carried off better than all of the Pakistan National Alliance leaders put together. He was as nimble footed at slipping round opposition protests and internal problems as he was brilliant at mesmerizing the masses, who would soon be listening to him in Lahore, Karachi, and Peshawar, as well as in Pindi, as he had promised roti kapda or makan to every Pakistani who voted for the Pakistan People's Party. The opposition resolved to wait no longer, presenting its final draft accord to Bhutto the day he returned from his Islamic summit tour. Ghafoor Ahmad insisted that the leaders wanted his response within 24 hours. They demanded immediate introduction of a central power sharing, Supreme Implementation Council that would supervise all functions of the government and all official agencies. It would have equal representation from among the leaders of the Pakistan National Alliance and Pakistan People's Party, chaired alternately by the president of one and the chairman of the other. Zulfi called the demand impossible and the Pakistan National Alliance's draft accord most humiliating and insulting. He had, after all, just met with Islam's leading kings, presidents, shahs, sheikhs, and amirs, all of whom treated him with honor and respect, if not always as a friend. Yet here was this gang of nine rushing up with an ultimatum that demanded he step aside tomorrow to take orders from them. Pirzada met again with Ghafoor on 25th June and presented an entirely different proposal, offering to establish a government Pakistan National Alliance Committee to supervise the election. The next day, Minister Mustafa Khar, special advisor to the Prime Minister for Political Affairs, warned the Pakistan People's Party is in a better position to launch a movement against the Pakistan National Alliance than vice versa. Its lion had started mobilizing Punjab. Now, Zulfi claimed to believe that the United States had actually formed the Pakistan National Alliance, as he told Turkish Ambassador Nehat Din on 27th June. He said it was simple and inexperienced Sardar Shehbaz Mazari of the National Democratic Party, who had written to all the other leaders initially suggesting the alliance. Zulfi told the ambassador in confidence that in the forthcoming elections he would attack the US, expose the US to Pakistani nation and to the world. Politics generated its own dynamics. There were some leaders who were intimidated, whereas there were others who believed in waiting and hitting back at the opportune moment. The ambassador advised against it, but Zulfi rarely heeded words of caution. A decade earlier, he had used his slingshot with deadly accuracy against his field marshal dictator. Now he would take aim at a superpower. He would teach Jimmy Carter and Cyrus Vance a few lessons. First, Bhutto would have to finish dealing with the Pakistan National Alliance, which wanted dissolution of the National Assembly as well as power sharing in a new super cabinet council. He gave in on the former and refused the latter, thinking he knew Mufti Mahmud and Ghafoor Ahmad well enough to feel they might accept it. But none of the Pakistan National Alliance leaders were willing at this point to agree to any formula other than power sharing formula they had devised. Both teams met the evening of July 1st to try to thrash out their differences and did not stop until 6:30 a.m. on July 2nd, reaching a final accord only after Zulfi did a last-minute switch step, agreeing to chair a Pakistan People's Party, Pakistan National Alliance super cabinet with a casting vote in case of an evenly divided disagreement. That accord was to be signed after the Pakistan National Alliance Central Council approved it. The council narrowly rejected it, instead raising 11 other points of consideration by the government, all of which were so minor that Zulfi was ready to agree, but to save face, insisted he would first have to consult his own party and cabinet. On the evening of 4th July, he called his most trusted cabinet members and General Zia together and told them he would break the deadlock the next day. Mumtaz and Hafiz Pirzada joined him for dinner at Prime Minister's house in Pindi that night, drinking and dining till after 1 a.m. Pirzada turned to his host before going home and said, "Congratulations, sir, the crisis is over." I asked him what made him say that. Zulfi recalled. He said that the steam had gone out of the opposition. I laughed and told Mumtaz to wash off some of Pirzada's perennial optimism. He replied by saying that in order to do that, he would have to take Pirzada to Sakhar barrage during high flood. All three of us laughed. Within 30 minutes, we heard the other laughter. "Wake up, get dressed, hurry," my mother called out sharply, rushing through my room to wake up my sister. Benazir remembered. Begum Nusrat's words were etched dramatically into the 24-year-old Oxford graduate's memory. "The army is taken over. The army is taken over. A coup. How could there be a coup? General Zia and the corps commanders had come personally to see my father 2 days before to pledge the army's loyalty to him. Her father was on the telephone speaking to General Zia, whom Benazir quotes as telling Zulfi, "I'm sorry, sir, I had to do it. We have to hold you in protective custody for a while. But in 90 days, I'll hold new elections. You'll be elected Prime Minister again, of course, sir, and I'll be saluting you." Zulfi's elder son, Mir Murtaza, soon to become founding leader of his own Al-Zulfikar band of Pakistan People's Party activists, was ready to resist, but his father cautioned, "Never resist a military coup. We must give them no pretext to justify our murders." It made Benazir shudder to think of how Mujib and most of his family had been assassinated in Dhaka 2 years before. "I have been blamed by some for not killing Mr. Bhutto on the night of the army taking over," noted Lieutenant General Faz Ali Chishti, commander of the Rawalpindi Corps that carried out the coup, codename Operation Fair Play. It was but one of several GHQ contingency plans and was executed smoothly without any need to use the tanks that had been deployed, or indeed to fire any of the recoilless rifles that had been issued by Chishti to his most trusted officers. Chishti was a good soldier, methodical, careful, well trained in all respects. Zia called him Murshid, mentor, and would soon put him in charge of the three federal ministries. Murshid, do not get me killed, Zia cautioned him that night, knowing full well, of course, that under Pakistan's constitution of 1973, any attempt at a military coup was deemed treason, punishable by death. Chishti had no regrets, but from that fateful dark night when almost all the leaders of the Pakistan National Alliance, as well as the Prime Minister and his closest Pakistan People's Party advisors and cabinet ministers were rudely awakened and driven off into military custody, Zia would have reason to fear that someday he would indeed be killed for that post midnight operation he had launched in the name of fair play.